You know, if you compare it to the war in Georgia, I think the stakes are much bigger here. We were able to broker a ceasefire in Georgia in 5 days, and now we're basically 5 weeks into this conflict. And the reason is simple. The stakes for Putin are too high, and I don't think we're anywhere near a ceasefire agreement because the two warring parties are so far apart.
And the sanctions have been the big weapon so far by the West to try and bring some kind of peace deal. They were introduced at an unprecedented pace. In your experience, do sanctions work?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the idea of sanctions is basically to send a clear message that there is a cost of war. And obviously, the wave of sanctions that the European Union has produced in a very short time is unprecedented. Basically, we're moving towards a stage where Russia will be completely isolated, politically, economically, financially, sport, transport, and eventually also energy. So it will work in the long run, but never underestimate the capacity of the Russian people to suffer and sustain discomfort and pain.
Isolating a country, does that bring the leader of that country to the table?
It probably should, but you never know with the Russians, because in the Russian psyche is this sense that they have always been isolated. I personally think that Putin miscalculated. He never thought that the West or the international community would be so united against his aggression. And what he really wanted, the exact reverse has happened. He wanted a disunited Europe. Well, it's never been as united as it is right now. He wanted to decouple the transatlantic partnership. Well, it's got rejuvenated. And on top of that, NATO's back on the stage, and Finland and Sweden will probably join NATO eventually. So I think, in order to protect his legacy, he did a huge, huge miscalculation.
One last question about sanctions, Alexander. Can you give me an example of where sanctions have produced a peace?
Well, South Africa, it sort of abolished apartheid. In Iran, we ended up getting a deal. In North Korea, it hasn't. But do we really want to see Russia become a new North Korea? I don't know.
And of course, we are still negotiating with Iran on that nuclear deal. There was one, and then there wasn't one, and now they're trying to get another one. But let's stay with Ukraine. Do you think the West is doing enough to try and end the conflict?
Yes, I think they're doing everything they can. You see, the instruments at disposal are a little bit different from what one is used to, say, in, for instance, World War II. So the instruments of war in this particular case, they are the sanctions that we talked about. They're financial instruments. They are financial aid to Ukraine, and they're armaments. And also this portrayal, I think, of solidarity. So it is probably almost everything that the European Union can do at the moment.
You were part, as I said at the beginning, of the negotiating team in Georgia in 2008. You negotiated then with Mr. Putin, then Prime Minister, or nominal Prime Minister. What did you learn about him which may be of use now?
Well, actually, to correct it a little bit, I did the negotiation in Georgia together with Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner, and our counterpart at the time was President Saakashvili. And then I flew to Moscow and was dealing with Sergei Lavrov. And then President Sarkozy of France came to deal with President Medvedev and Putin. Now, I have met Putin a few times. What are the lessons to be drawn? The lessons are very simple. He's very well prepared. He's very analytical. And all of those people who think that he's irrational or has lost his marbles because of COVID isolation, I don't think they know what they're talking about. And to be honest, I think they are barking up the wrong tree. You have to understand what he's trying to achieve. He wants to make Russia great again. That is his aim. And that is the rationality of his actions. Whether then they end up achieving what he wants is a completely different story.
When you were negotiating about Georgia, you came up with a plan, a 5-point peace plan, in less than a week. How did that process work, and how did you come up with a plan so quickly?
Well, it was pretty simple. There's this sort of, frenzy of diplomatic phone calls. And then when we arrived in Tbilisi, we basically opened my laptop and started drafting traditional points for a possible ceasefire agreement, which had to do, obviously, with the withdrawal of troops of both sides. It had to do with the notion of a ceasefire and also respecting territorial integrity and creating humanitarian corridors. So you use sort of a set language that you usually have in ceasefires. Now, rumors are that the ceasefire agreement that is being discussed, or at least allegedly discussed, has over 15 points. So it's probably a completely different kettle of fish. And the reason is simple. This conflict, this war, is much more complicated than the one we had in Georgia in August 2008.
So how do you read, Alexander, the current negotiations?
To be honest, these things are usually gradual. So you start with second-tier diplomats. Then you start moving into first-tier diplomats. Then you might get some politicians involved. And the big shots, say President Putin or President Zelensky, do not get involved unless there is a really deal imminent. So therefore, I can just conclude that we're nowhere near a ceasefire agreement at this particular stage.
Okay, do you know or can you guess at what the options are on the table?
To be honest, I don't see many options. And I say this also as the chairman of the board of Martti Ahtisaari's Peace Foundation, CMI. He knew one or two things about mediating peace, whether it was, Namibia or Kosovo or Aceh or Northern Ireland. There you usually have some kind of a ballpark that you're dealing with. But listen, if Putin says basically that he wants to take over Ukraine and denazify Ukraine, which basically means changing the government, and then Zelensky says that he wants to defend the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine, there isn't really that much you can do. That's why we're still in this war, unfortunately.
Is the bottom line, Alexander, some kind of face-saving formula for Mr. Putin?
Well, I think there are really three options here. One is that he withdraws, tries to save his face back home, which with information war is possible, but in reality is quite difficult because, from what I understand, it's already about 75% of Russian troops engaged, and they haven't achieved their goals, which were supposed to happen in 48 hours. They haven't been able to do that in 5 weeks. The second option is some kind of a divided Ukraine, east and west, whatever that means in terms of territory. Could be a possible face-saver for Putin, but I just don't know and I don't see how Zelensky could do that. The third option is, of course, that Putin starts using more serious military means, which would begin, of course, with chemical weapons and then move into nuclear warheads. I don't believe that he will go this far, especially with the nuclear side.
Earlier, you talked about NATO and Finland possibly joining NATO. When you were Prime Minister, was there a feeling Finland should join NATO? Because the current polls suggest there is a large amount of public support for joining NATO. And if so, how much more would that antagonize the Kremlin?
Well, I guess on the first question, it depends on who you're opposing it to. I have always been an advocate of NATO membership, but I was in a very distinct minority. 50% of the population were against NATO membership, roughly 20% in favor. And to be honest, I believed in the values that NATO stands for as a defense alliance of democratic nations, but took a lot of hits, political hits in a democracy because of that. Now, with the war in Ukraine, Finnish opinion polls have reversed 180 degrees and then more. In other words, we now have 61 to 62% in favor of NATO membership and roughly 16 to 19% against. And I think Finns in this particular situation are driven by realistic and rational fear, which basically means that we never want to be left alone again in the face of a grand aggressor in the same way we were when the Soviet Union attacked us in the Winter War during World War II.
I was going to ask you about the changes you think this has meant for Europe, and Finland joining NATO would be a major one, wouldn't it, because of this conflict?
Well, I think it's a natural step in the ultimate westernization of Finland. The membership in the European Union after the Cold War was one example, and now joining NATO is another one. Of course, it means a lot, but to be honest, we have been very NATO compatible ever since the 1990s. We bought over 60 F-18s. We just acquired or purchased another 64 F-35s. We do NATO training exercises. We have been involved in NATO missions in, for instance, Afghanistan. So really the only thing we don't have is Article 5. But there is a change. We have to understand that this is not only about Russia versus the West, it is about the global order. And the way in which we should read the UN vote is to say that yes, 141 states against Russia, yes, for Russia, and then 35 abstain. But those 35, they represent roughly 50% of the world's population. So I think a key state here is China. And we in the West have to understand that the international order has been created in the image of the victors of World War II, and in many ways in the image of the West. So if something comes out of this, we need to think about the global order anew and what that means. And that will require cooperation between China and the West.
Do you think, in summary, Alexander, this conflict will be solved only on the battlefield or around the negotiating table?
You always need both, you know? I mean, every war is like that. You fight it out in the battlefield, and then eventually there is peace and peace negotiation. The thing is, we just don't know how long this is going to last. You know, the winter war in Finland lasted 105 days. The war in Korea was longer. The war in Afghanistan was 10 years. So we simply don't know. So first, there will be military conflict, as we can see, and then eventually there will be peace. But be and rest assured, this will not be forgotten by the rest of the world, and especially not by Europeans or Ukrainians. Ukraine, from now on, is European, not Russia.
Alexander Stubb, many thanks to you, Alexander, for joining us on The Agenda.
My pleasure. Thanks.